is Paul Dermine. I'm a Belgian national. I'm an academic researcher in the field of European affairs and European law, and I'm more particularly focusing my research on the governance of the Eurozone, the future of Europe, and the further fiscal and social integration of the European Union.
Hello and welcome to idEU's new interview. Hello, Paul Dermine. I'd like to thank you wholeheartedly for being with us today to speak about the economic and monetary governance of the EU, a subject that you research for your PhD at Maastricht University. More particularly, I'd like to focus on the following question. After the COVID-19 pandemic, what future for the economic and monetary governance of the EU? So let's delve right into the core of the subject. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU institutions have announced a myriad of economic and monetary measures. We can, for example, talk about the ECB, which has launched its new pandemic emergency purchase program. We can also talk about the Commission with its next generation EU plan that would substantially increase the budgetary capacity of the EU. But finally, we can also talk about the Council, who is now discussing a recovery plan of more than 750 billion euros of grants and loans. So Paul, do you believe these measures will be able to prevent or effectively mitigate the unprecedented crisis that is currently taking shape?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I can only give you a prediction, and my prediction would be that if everything that's currently on the table is, at the end of the day, adopted, it could very much contribute to mitigate the effects of the ongoing recession. So we'll have, of course, to see what will occur, especially on the fiscal and economic side. So whether the member states will be ready to follow the Commission in its very ambitious and far-reaching proposal. But I'm actually quite optimistic, much more optimistic than what I was maybe 2 months ago, where we were all thinking that everything would, in the end, fall apart. And I think that now the whole environment is much more positive in a way. So we'll have to see. But so far the EU has been, in a way, pretty efficient in its response, especially if you compare to what had been done a decade ago. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see. We're not there yet, but at least positive signs from the political world, certainly.
Yes, exactly. And the consequences on the social rights may be a subject that we can talk about, because in 2016 you wrote a piece with Professor de Schutter, which, by the way, we have interviewed, so make sure to check out the video on ideu.eu. The link will be in the description below. So the article that you wrote with Professor de Schutter is called The Two Constitutions of Europe. In it you contend that the sovereign debt crisis and the measures enacted by the institutions in response rendered the task of implementing and financing public policies in support of social rights more difficult. To what extent do you think today's coronavirus crisis and the planned economic recovery plan will have an impact on social rights within the member states? Do you think that we are engaging in the same approach towards fundamental rights, or has something changed?
Yeah, negotiations are currently ongoing, but I think that there's been a shift in the way everything is, taking shape. So, for example, this notion of conditionality, which was truly central back in the days of the Eurozone crisis, has lost a bit of its appeal. So we see that, of course, some conditions will be attached to the funds, either its loans or grants made available to the member states. But certainly the conditionality will be a different kind of conditionality than the one we've seen with the Eurozone crisis, which was a conditionality very much emphasizing fiscal consolidation, flexibilization of labor law, internal devaluation. So I think that the political emphasis on that will be much more minor than it was 10 years ago. And we see that the emphasis is much more on the greening of the economy, is much more on digitalization, still a bit on structural reforms. But I don't think that we can expect the EU to ask the same kind of things that it has asked to, whether it's Greece, Portugal, or Cyprus. I don't think that we'll see the same kind of very, harsh austerity plans being implemented.
Despite the Netherlands, Austria,
well,
and maybe Sweden.
Of course, I mean, the four frugals are still pushing for this kind of solution, but their political weight is much, much minor than it used to be, especially because Germany and Chancellor Merkel now have, in a way, changed views on these matters. But of course, you can expect a bit of conditionality. But I think we passed this era of austerity and labor law flexibilization. I mean, I think we passed that. But there, I mean, that's really the core of the debate. Currently that's the core of the debate: is what kind of conditionality will you attach to the money? Which kind of policy priorities will you push forward? But when you see, you know, the whole political discussions going on, the emphasis, that the austerity ideas have lost a bit of a bite.
And especially because now the expenses that are related to the pandemic are difficult. It's difficult to impose a conditionality on them because it's not really the fault of the governments, while in the case of the Greek debt or the Cyprus debt, it was a little bit different.
No, exactly. So the whole philosophy of conditionality makes much less sense in this crisis than it may have made sense in the previous ones. So that's one thing. But the second thing is also that, you know, we've had this experience of austerity, and everyone is now basically challenging these economic policy paradigms. I mean, if you read what the IMF is telling us, if you read what the World Bank is telling us, 10 years ago they were very much in favor of austerity and fiscal contraction, and now they've totally shifted the narrative. And so the EU, I think, will follow the same kind of path. But the EU is always a bit, you know, late. Has always a couple of years of, in a way, backlog compared to other international organizations.
The institution's limited internalization of social and economic rights in the aftermath of the sovereign debt crisis engendered a political reaction that can be described as a regain of popular support for fringe, Eurosceptic and extreme right parties across the EU. From Podemos in Spain to Lega Nord in Italy, passing through France's Rassemblement National, extreme parties are on the rise again. In 2019, after the May 26th elections in Belgium, which pushed to the fore the Flemish nationalist and extreme right party Vlaams Belang, you wrote that it was time to get rid of the so-called Cordon Sanitaire. Can you explain what precisely that is and why you argued in favor of putting a halt to the practice?
Yeah, so that's something completely different. No, indeed. So it's just that in the direct aftermath of the May 2019 election, I was a bit shocked by the reaction, especially of the French-speaking media. You know, not wanting to, you know, interview members of Vlaams Belang, conduct investigations on them. No, you can already see that it's changing. For example, the RTBF has done a very nice investigation about Vlaams Belang a couple of weeks ago. But basically, my point was that actually we may have reached a point where actually the Cordon Sanitaire has the opposite effect of the one it was, you know, originally established for. And my view is that actually it strengthens populist parties, it strengthens extreme movements, because by not engaging with them, you basically give them a blank check to develop their ideas, uncontested and undebated. So my view is that at least the Cordon Sanitaire médiatique, I think it should be broken. Then, of course, the political Cordon Sanitaire, that's another issue. But at least when it comes to the media, when it comes to the press, I don't see why it should be maintained. And I think it's actually dangerous to keep it the way we have it, because I mean, we now have a Vlaams Belang that is, according to the latest polls, the first party in Flanders, and so their ideas need to be engaged with, their politicians need to be combated, and it's too easy to, you know, just stick your head in the sand and not take the problem seriously. I think it's a counterproductive view, but of course, I'm also very much aware that this is a sensitive issue. But I think Belgium remains quite exceptional in that regard, and I don't see why we should, keep that specificity which no longer makes sense.
But if we then are to take the American election, for example, it pushed to the fore President Trump, which was a fringe candidate at some point, and it was really the media that pushed him towards the place he is in now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's true, because when you see the media that matters most right now, it's no longer the traditional media, it's the social media. And on the social media, these guys, they evolve the way they want. And so actually what you would need from the traditional public media is, give another side of the story and give, counter-arguments to the propaganda that is currently being diffused without any limits, without any constraints on social media. So the whole normalization argument, I don't really buy it anymore.
To pursue this political note a bit longer, I wanted to discuss your views on the future of Europe. In an article published both on the website of the think tank, the Friday Group, and in l'Echo, called Réexister budgetairement pour revivre politiquement, you say that it is high time for the EU to reinvent itself. You also wrote that your hopes for such redefinition lied in the 2019 European Parliament elections. Having seen the results of these elections, what are your projections in terms of reform of the EMU, but also more generally of the EU? Do you think that a context in favor of reform has been created by these elections?
Well, to a certain extent, I believe we are at one of these moments in the process of European integration where we could, make an actual quantitative leap. I think we are at one of these key moments where the integration process might be further, deepened, and also maybe that its ideological imprints might be, in a way, shifted or adjusted. But I don't think it's the result of the European elections, actually. I think it's more going to be the result of this ongoing pandemic and the economic recession that will follow. Because, to be honest, before the pandemic, I didn't have, and many observers didn't really have great hope about what, van der Leyen would be able to achieve, especially because politically she was rather weak. She was, an intergovernmental candidate without huge support in the parliament. And also she had taken a very pragmatic and realistic approach. But I think most definitely the COVID-19 crisis will change that. And so it's interesting to see how, especially the Commission is trying, to take advantage of this window of opportunity that has suddenly opened to come up with very ambitious proposals. And yeah, the political conditions have adjusted as well. We now have a clear, we have a much stronger Franco-German axis that has managed to, overcome its disagreements. And so I think that potentially big changes might be coming up. Of course, the big question is to what extent these changes will remain temporary to react to the ongoing crisis, or whether they will, ultimately become more permanent features of the European Union. So, for example, that's very clear in the debate about the recovery instrument. Well, will it be something very fine-tuned and tailor-made to this crisis we're living in, or will this actually, build the basis for an actual fiscal federalism, autonomous fiscal powers for the EU, and true fiscal solidarity? So we'll have to see. It's too soon to tell, but I see a certain window of opportunity that has opened. I know it's for the member states and the EU institution to take advantage of it. They may not, because to a certain extent the Eurozone crisis also opened the window of opportunity on these issues. And it wasn't, fully exploited. So we'll have to see, but yeah, potentially this might be one of these key moments of the whole process of European integration.
Yes, because the sovereign debt crisis entailed the informal amendment of the treaties, but now I was talking about a formal one, and that is maybe more difficult because it needs always a intergovernmental agreement.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that it has absolutely not been put on the table. Of course, we have the Convention on the Future of Europe coming up. But so far, there hasn't been any discussions about future treaty amendments. But I think it's also because politically the Commission deems it more desirable to wait a bit, wait until the Convention is actually launched, so that should be in a few months. And so that's the reason why they've currently sought to function on the basis of the treaties we currently have. This is also why they've done some weird things using legal basis in a very weird and acrobatical manner in a way. But yeah, I mean, obviously the changes that we are trying to precipitate right now, that the Commission is trying to precipitate, if we want them to become more permanent in the future, you will not be able to escape future treaty revision. So especially, I mean, if you want to deepen the powers of the EU in the economic and fiscal policy field, you will need a treaty revision.
Now let's delve more deeply into monetary and economic governance and law. In the article we were just talking about, you posit that by addressing three problems, the budgetary capacity of member states could be restored and hence their political process revived. I will address two of these avenues for reform. But before doing that, let me ask you this. What is your take on neoliberal policies such as austerity? In your opinion, why are EU institutions holding on to such policies almost desperately?
Well, I think like any dogma, it's very difficult to go beyond them because it's you consider it as a truth, but in a way it's a belief. I don't have very extreme views on austerity. I think in some places it worked. In some places a bit of austerity was necessary. The problem is, of course, that the EU did austerity in a rather extreme manner without taking, other kinds of interests into account, especially fundamental rights, especially social rights. But I do believe that in some parts of the Eurozone, some austerity was warranted. In Greece, probably some austerity was warranted. But of course, the question is how you do austerity. If you do it in a smart and reasoned manner, or if you do it in an extreme and dogmatic manner. And the problem lies more particularly in the way it's been done over the past decade. So, I mean, obviously, it's going to stay there because some countries need to engage into some kind of fiscal consolidation. Italy, for example, will not be able to evade some more consolidation measures because obviously the debt levels are unsustainable in Italy. But yeah, the whole difference is how you do it and also whether that austerity and consolidation is complemented by fiscal expansion, fiscal support, financial assistance. So that's the whole issue.
You say that we should try and diminish the current expenses by rationalizing and adjusting them to the requirements of today's world. What do you precisely mean by adjusting and rationalizing? Do you suggest today's expenses mismatch our society's reality?
No, not necessarily, but I think that in every EU member state there's lots of money simply being lost because the public sector and the administration is not entirely efficient, and we see it very clearly here in Belgium. I think that there's lots of financial means that are being lost simply because of institutional inadequacies. So I think that there's also a need to spend. There's a need to invest, but there's also a need for the public sector to, seriously self-reflect about, the way it functions and the way it could be further rationalized and made more efficient. So that I'm also very much convinced that much of that is also needed currently.
Second, you posit that states should act sustainably in favor of growth. My question to you in that regard pertains to the flattening or even decreasing curves of growth. Do you think it is possible to act sustainably in favor of growth within an economy that is stagnating?
Well, I think that's one of the main reasons why one would argue to go beyond austerity. And I think that, when I wrote that piece, that was in a pre-COVID world. And so clearly, the political and economic debates are now much beyond that. And I think that everyone agrees that there's There's a need for ambitious public investment. There's been a bit of a return to, classical Keynesian policies of fiscal expansion and public investment in, sectors that much need it. But of course, the key question now is really going to be how do you spend the money, and that's the main point where the Commission is currently being criticized. That it has remained highly cryptic in the ways. Because we have so much experience of European money being simply lost in inefficient projects or simply being captured by corruptive circles. So I think that's the key challenge, is how the money is going to be spent. Because it's really nice to say, okay, we're going to focus on green investment, we're going to focus on digitalization, but okay, concretely, how do you make sure that you put the money where the mouth is?
You are referring to the conditionality that could be associated to Hungary and Poland.
Well, not even conditionality, but simply administratively speaking, how do you organize all this to make sure that that money will be wisely spent? And currently, it's not entirely clear how that's going to happen. And then, of course, you have the very specific question of rule of law conditionality, which is very specific to Hungary and Poland. That's another debate. And it's interesting to note that in the Commission's proposal, there's absolutely no trace of rule of law conditionality, in spite of the fact that it was something that was quite fashionable a couple of months ago. But here, for, I think, a very political reason, the Commission has decided not to include rule of law-based conditionality. It's been criticized already.
Fidesz is still part of the EPP, right?
Yeah, but it's also politically very sensitive to tell, well, we're going to put 750 billion on the table, but Hungary and Poland, so that is around, 80, 90 million of European citizens won't be able to, take advantage of it. So I think that's politically very difficult to do. Then, of course, from a more principled perspective, you might argue in favor of, keeping rule of law-based conditionality, but politically it's extremely difficult. But that's another question. What I was more referring to is really to make sure that, this money is wisely spent and actually realizes the objectives that, were initially pursued. So digitalizing the economy, greening the economy. So it's very nice as a political slogan, as a political motto, but then in practice, how do you make it happen? It's much more difficult.
In another article about the Greek sovereign debt, you mentioned the ideas of Piketty and Stiglitz for the restructuration of sovereign debt. Can you elaborate on these ideas?
Well, that's a famous proposal that was made by many economists, most prominently by Piketty in his project for a treaty democratizing the governance of the Eurozone, but Stiglitz has also made such proposal. The idea is to mutualize past debts. So that's something quite different than what is currently ongoing, because currently we will be creating new debt for the future. The idea of Piketty, Stiglitz, is mutualizing past debt. So you basically take national debt beyond a certain threshold. So for example, Piketty proposes the 60% threshold from the Maastricht Treaty, and basically put it together to make sure that it's more easily repaid, and that you don't have this very harsh legacy that is going to be extremely difficult for countries like Italy or even France or even Belgium to go beyond in the future. But I think that's politically unfeasible. So the more feasible option is the one that is currently on the table. So creating joint debt instruments for the future, because it's a much safer move than the one proposed by these economists. So that's a bit currently out of the picture. But yeah, I think that there's a very strong economic argument supporting it. But yeah, politically speaking, it's very difficult to do so.
Yes, we will talk about the Eurobond a bit later on. Talking about sovereign debt inevitably leads us to the supranational level. Before the pandemic entered into the picture, you and other academics have repeatedly criticized the fundamental structure and dichotomic divide of the EMU. In doing so, you call for the recognition that economic and monetary policies operate in a continuum. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's an observation that is shared by many, and it simply relates to the initial structure of the Eurozone, which was established as a very asymmetric Eurozone with a very strong monetary pillar, exclusive competence for the ECB, total abandonment of national prerogatives on monetary policy, a highly integrated structure within the Euro system with the ECB, and then a very weak economic and fiscal power based on the principle of national responsibility, decentralization, and only negative surveillance occurring at the supranational level. And so from very early on, economists, macroeconomists, political economists have been saying that, well, it's not tenable on the long term. It's not sustainable on the long term. The Eurozone crisis was the first alarm. States reacted by somehow reducing that asymmetry, but that asymmetry is still there, and we can definitely see it with the current crisis. It's quite blatant, how the monetary pillar is extremely strong. The ECB has been able to react within days, whereas the economic and fiscal pillar remains highly weak. States are still discussing the fiscal and the economic response to the crisis. So the asymmetry is still there. The lack of common fiscal tools, common economic firepower, that lack is still there. And of course, the whole debate is how do we further reduce that asymmetry? How do we rebalance the system? How do we make it more symmetric? And yeah, it's interesting that this debate is coming up again. And well, the circumstances might be slightly more, favorable for that quantitative leap to finally occur. So we'll have to see, but the conditions are much more favorable in a way.
In an article written in the Maastricht Journal of European and Comparative Law, you argue that a rebalancing act should take place between independence and accountability in the ECB's mandate. Why do you think this is necessary, and how should it be done in your opinion?
So that's very specific to the monetary pillar. And so it relates to basically the initial bargain that was made in Maastricht was, on the one hand, to have a central bank that would be empowered with a very narrow mandate, solely focused on one objective, that is the preservation of price stability, fighting against high inflation. So that was, if you read the treaties, that's the primary mission of the ECB. On the other hand, the other element of the bargain is that in order to pursue that very narrow mandate, in order to pursue that single policy goal that it was supposed to strive for, the ECB was endowed with very, very strong independence. So many describe the ECB as the most independent central bank in the world. So it's a very powerful institution because it doesn't have to answer for what it is doing. What I've been saying, and others have been saying it as well, is that one element of this initial bargain no longer exists. So the ECB no longer has that very narrow mandate. So the powers of the ECB have been dramatically strengthened with the sovereign debt crisis. We see that the actual mandate that it is implementing is much broader than one solely focused on price stability. So it has gained new powers. It has a new understanding of its own mandate. So that element of the bargain has evolved, but on the other hand, the independence remains as strong as it used to be. And that's problematic because if you have a central bank that is now doing price stability, but also support for financial stability, support for employment, support for growth, it's pursuing different policy goals. So, the rationale for strong independence is no longer there. So you could argue for a weaker form of independence with more accountability vis-à-vis, representative institutions such as the European Parliament, more answerability before courts. So currently we have a bit of a mismatch, a bit of a misalignment. So what I've been calling for, what colleagues have been calling for, is basically a readjustment. So either the ECB returns to its pre-Eurozone crisis situation with a much narrow mandate, with a much more limited power, but actually that's not feasible because we need the ECB as powerful as it is. We've seen it with the COVID-19 crisis. So what we then need, if we start from that point on, well, we need stronger accountability, stronger legal accountability, stronger political accountability. And in a way, if you read the recent decision of the German Constitutional Court, that's basically what the German judges are saying. They're saying, well, we've now reached a point where the ECB has gained tremendous new powers, where the ECB can very much favor the reading of its mandates it prefers. And this is problematic from an accountability perspective. This is problematic from a constitutional perspective. Then, of course, the German judges move on to have a certain readings of the ECB powers that I personally do not agree with. But this ruling of the Bundesverfassungsgericht very much underlines this imbalance between too strict an independence and too extended monetary powers for the ECB.
So then, practically speaking, because that was actually going to be my next question, the judgment, the vice judgment of the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany. In May 2020, the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rendered its much-awaited vice judgment. In an unprecedented move, the FCC declared the ECB's QE program ultra vires, meaning that it considers QE to breach the principle of conferral. In your opinion, what consequences does this judgment entail for the mandate of the ECB?
So here you have different levels. The first level is the immediate reaction of the ECB to the ruling of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. And there it's very clear that the ECB is not going to do anything. So the ECB, a few days after the ruling came out, the ECB issued a press release saying the ECB is a new institution. It's only accountable. It's only answerable before the ECJ. So the only relevant ruling here is the ruling of the Court of Justice, which fully validated the quantitative easing program of the ECB. So that's the first reaction. And the second reaction, that's what occurred a week ago. The ECB further expanded its pandemic program. So it means that it's proposing even more ambitious terms, it's putting even more money on the table. So it's clearly telling you that the central bankers in Frankfurt are not gonna, backtrack from what they were doing. So I think it's now become totally clear that the ECB is not gonna do anything. Now what's gonna happen next is how the German government and the German parliament will react to the ruling. Because if you take the ruling is primarily addressed to German institutions. And the German institutions need to basically come up with a justification of quantitative easing, showing that it's actually proportional. So that's still a big question mark. So whether the German Constitutional Court will be satisfied or not remains to be seen. But so we still have that potential threat that if the German Constitutional Court is not satisfied, it will instruct the Bundesbank to stop its participation to the quantitative easing program. And that, I don't think we'll get there. I think we'll find a solution which allows everyone to basically save face. But if we were to get there, then it would be a big constitutional crisis, because then the German central bank would be, in a situation of conflict of loyalties, having to, on the one hand, obey the ECB, to which it is subject to, as a central bank part of the Euro system, and on the other hand, as a German institution, having to, comply with the rulings of its German constitutional courts. But I don't think we'll get there. So that's for the short term. And then on the long term, I think that this ruling will be of systemic relevance, and I think that it's a ruling that will become a landmark case in the history of the Eurozone. I think it's not entirely absent from the decision of Chancellor Merkel to take a totally different approach vis-à-vis financial solidarity, further fiscal integration. I think the ruling certainly played a role in Merkel making that historical choice. That's one. And secondly, I believe that it will also make the European Court of Justice move. So it's quite likely that the ECJ will, adjust the tests and the technical tools it is using, especially to delineate monetary policy measures from economic policy measures. So even if the ruling does so in a very aggressive and insulting manner, because it's quite, it's quite striking. How harsh the language in that ruling is. I think the signal sent is a legitimate one. That, well, the European judges need to flesh their tests further out, because currently they're being too differential. Currently they're simply believing what the ECB is telling us it is doing, and that's not sufficient from a constitutional perspective. If you want, meaningful judicial review, you need the judges to actually engage with what the ECB is actually doing. So we'll have to see, of course. But so on the short term, I don't think it will change much. But on the longer term, I see that ruling having potential repercussions. And that's purely with regard to the Eurozone implications of the ruling. Because, of course, it's a ruling that is interesting from many perspectives. Also, it has strong implications for the principle of supremacy. It has strong implications for the whole rule of law crisis. So that the ruling has very much been criticized from that perspective, saying, well, what are you doing? You're basically giving the Polish government and the Hungarian government further, tools and arguments to rely upon. But that's not what I was having it about. So from a purely EMU perspective, I think the ruling is an important one. It might be seen as an unwise one, but I also see it as a welcome wake-up call in a way.
Now I'd like to talk about your article on Verfassingsblog. You ended by asking rhetorical questions such as, are national governments still really able to implement disruptive economic programs and experiment other policies than those traditionally promoted by the union technocracies? Does national economic and budgetary sovereignty still really mean something? If not, is it not high time to endow the EU with the positive ability to democratically design an economic and fiscal policy of its own? So with regard to these questions, I wanted to ask you the following. If it is indeed high time to endow the EU with the ability to design an economic and fiscal policy of its own, do you think the Corona bond or Eurobond could represent such an institutional design? If so, can you explain what it is and on what basis it could be financed?
Yes, certainly what is currently going on, what is currently being put on the table would very much strengthen the EU's powers in the economic and fiscal policy field. And it would certainly contribute to endow the EU with the actual means to implement an economic and fiscal policy of its own. So that's certain. Now, of course, the question is which policy are we going to implement and how is that policy going to be decided? I'm afraid that the democratic deficit that has been criticized for so long is still a bit there. And the Parliament has been quite vocal about this, that it wants to have its say in how the money is going to be spent, what kind of political program is going to be followed, because currently these discussions would be primarily going on at the level of the Commission, at the level of the Council, so the classic, neo-intergovernmental narrative. But yeah, I see ongoing evolution as quite positive when it comes to actually undowing the EU with stronger fiscal and economic policy tools. So
that would not be limited only to the expenses related to the pandemic, but would really mean a mutualization of the debt more generally?
The Commission has a very extremely broad reading of what could be financed. So it's not expenses strictly related to the pandemic. So it's not expenses strictly related to the health sector. It's basically any kind of economic support measure, any kind of structural reforms, financing. So it's very broad. So of course we'll have to see, because this is still on the table. But yeah, it could cover a lot of different things.
Yes, and then on the basis of the, with regards, sorry, to the funding of such a Eurobond, that would rather be through the amendment of the fiscal policy of the European Union, because a digital tax would have, for example, to be levied, or a green tax, Piguvian, or...
Yeah, so here, I mean, the sources contemplated are very diverse. So the first one is the so-called, I mean, it's no longer labeled Corona bonds, but it's the same. It's basically collective joint debt instruments. So basically the EU using its AAA rating to raise money on the capital markets in its own name, but of course with, you know, the collective guarantee provided by the 27 member states. So that would be one source. And then the other source contemplated would be new own resources, so potentially new European taxes. And here various channels are currently contemplated. But indeed, the financial transaction tax is one possibility. Another possibility is taxing the GAFA. So again, we'll have to see, and this will take a lot of time, obviously, because this is totally new. The EU is not known for, you know, its rapidity. So yeah, I think the think tank Bruegel has published figures, and it does not anticipate these new sources to see the light of the day before, I think, 2022 or 2023. So it's going to be a long-term process for sure. So the raising of the money on the capital markets could occur more rapidly, but then, for example, the new own resources, the new European tax, this will definitely take much longer.
Mm-hmm. If it is indeed high time for the EU to endow itself with a real economic capacity, do you believe the current institutional setup is sufficient, or do you think the EP should be endowed with more powers in terms of economic policy? In the alternative, should enhanced cooperation be mobilized to create a Euro assembly?
Well, I mean, here there's two different answers. From a strictly legal perspective, it's totally fine to bypass the parliament, because that's how the procedures are established. But then, of course, from a legitimacy perspective, from a purely democratic perspective, it's much more questionable, right? That the most representative institution in the EU is not going to be given an equal say in these discussions about, you know, how we want to, you know, shape the next decade, where we want to invest these tremendous amounts of money. It's not normal from a democratic perspective that, or at least it's not desirable, that the EP is too much sidelined. So we'll have to see how this will shape up. But from a purely legal perspective, it's unfortunately fine to keep the parliament aside. Even if on questions, for example, about taxation, the parliament would have a certain powers. So it's not powerless, but it's certainly not as an important decision maker as the council would be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so last question then. To finish off this interview, I'd like to add a green note. In 2019, you signed an open letter alongside a number of other academics and researchers imploring the ECB to stop investing in portfolios linked to businesses and actors with a high carbon footprint, such as, for example, the oil industry. So do you know if Christine Lagarde has acted upon her ambition to lead the ECB at the forefront of the fight against climate change?
Well, this was definitely a big issue before the pandemic kicked in. So the ECB is conducting a very in-depth review of its own monetary policy mandate. So it's something that Lagarde launched when she took power. And the question of greening monetary policy was truly central in there. But then, of course, I mean, the COVID kicked in. And so it's all suddenly become secondary because obviously the ECB is exclusively focused on tackling the effects of the pandemic and the ensuing economic recession. But the issue is still there. I think that the ECB is still working in that regard. And I mean, most definitely we can expect changes in that regard because there's a deep institutional reflection going on this issue. And I think that it would be doable for the ECB to apply stricter green criteria for its operations on capital markets. I think it's perfectly feasible. It would be ambitious, it would be far-reaching, it would be controversial as well. But I think the ECB could do so. At least legally, I don't see anything preventing it from doing so. But we'll have to see. I mean, currently the efforts are exclusively focused on the COVID situation. But we can certainly expect that issue to come back to the agenda.
I'd like to thank you again, Paul Dermine, on behalf of idEU for your time, engagement and illuminating interventions in today's slightly longer than planned interview. And to all of you watching this video, good night and good luck.